Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today, I want to talk about one of the most important fundamental concepts we have in the BDSM community: drop. While it doesn't get as much attention as terms like safe word or aftercare, it is just as important to know about before you do your first scene. So today, let's talk about what drop is, what causes it, and what you can do to prevent the worst of it. So first of all, what exactly is drop? So drop is a term used to refer to the general bad feelings one can have after a BDSM scene. These bad feelings can be physical, mental, and/or emotional, and vary in intensity from person to person and experience to experience. Different people can do the same scene, even with the same partner, and have very different experiences with drop. One might walk away basically scot-free with only a little lethargy the day after, and the other might have a low mood, a headache, and be irritable for a few days afterwards. It just depends on your body, how you react to kink, and what, if any, underlying conditions you might have. The same person can even have totally distinct experiences of drop depending on what kind of play they do, how much they've played recently, or how they're feeling going into the scene. The fact drop can vary so much makes it a little hard to pin down, but we'll talk about the ways you can figure out what your typical drop looks like so you can plan ahead for it a little bit later on. Now, before we go on, I want to note that I am intentionally using the term drop as a catch-all to be clear that drop can happen to anyone who does BDSM, regardless of their role or type of play they engage in. When I first encountered the community, it was nearly exclusively called Subdrop. This term implies that drop is something that only happens to submissives or other people who are generally on the receiving end of kink experiences. You'd hear the corollary term Topdrop occasionally, but it was never talked about as much, and a bold line often separated the two terms. This left people who aren't part of the top-bottom or sub-dom spectrums and switches out of the conversation, despite the fact that they can also very much experience drop. So that's why I prefer to use the term drop as a way to talk about it versus more specific terminology. But this is not to say that everyone who does kink, from a dominant to a bratty little, experiences drop the exact same way. Just that drop can happen to anyone, regardless of what they do or how hard they play. Next, let's talk about some of the common ways that drop can manifest itself. Some of the most immediately recognizable signs tend to be physical in nature. Things like chills, body aches, headaches, lethargy, trouble sleeping, excessive sleeping, soreness, or stiff muscles. These symptoms are particularly common if the play you did included impact play or bondage, and are separate from the immediate physical reactions you might have to a scene, things like bruises, welts, or broken skin. The mental and emotional side effects tend to be a little harder to identify for people, but can include things like low mood and irritability, like I already mentioned, also things like sensitivity, sadness, anxiety, feelings of guilt or shame, or feelings of emptiness or worthlessness. Compared to physical side effects, these ones tend to be more common if your play includes emotional sadomasochism, service, or power exchange elements. Though it is important to note that potentially any kind of play in any combination can cause any of these symptoms to happen. And these symptoms, particularly the emotional and mental ones, don't always appear right after a scene. Depending on how intense your play was and how long you played for, you might be floating on a scene high for a couple of days after you play, and the longer you float, the stronger and longer your drop is likely to be. Typically, though, most drop tends to start either the day after a scene or up to a few days later, maybe 3 or 4 out at the most, at least in my experience. It can last anywhere from half a day to a couple of days, up to maybe 5 days to a week, especially if you did several scenes back to back without a chance to come down and process in between them. That's one of the most important things to put into your risk calculation if you want to play often. Don't be like Archer. Don't be in a position where the cumulative hangover might kill you if you stop playing for a couple of days. If you are used to scening, say, 3 to 5 days a week, back to back to back, most weeks, I would really encourage you to at least take a week or two off occasionally. I know playing that often feels really good, and if it's part of your relationship, it might be hard to want to stop. But burnout sucks more than anything else, and if you want to keep enjoying what you're doing, it is better to pace yourself, sorry to say. I've known a few people who have dove headfirst into kink, only to then majorly burn themselves because they didn't slow down and take pauses when they should have to process. They just keep doing more and more and more for longer and longer because it just felt so good, and they thought they would never experience drop because it hadn't hit them yet, only to find out that a severe drop was waiting for them the second they had to take a weekend off from months and months of habitual play. Not to scare anyone too much, of course, I just want to make sure that folks know that can happen. It's not necessarily common, but it is something that can happen, especially if you are playing again back to back to back for a very long period of time. But besides the duration of your scene and how often you play, what else can impact how intense your drop is? As I've already mentioned, your underlying conditions, if you have any, can make a big difference here. If you have a mood disorder, you may feel more pronounced and long-lasting emotional and mental drop than someone who doesn't. If you have a chronic illness, BDSM can cause a flare-up, even if it may help relieve some of your symptoms in the moment. If you have a connective tissue disorder, doing a scene might make you stiff and sore for a couple of days. I could iterate on examples like this for forever, but chances are, if you know you have an underlying condition, you can brainstorm for yourself how this might lead to drop, and I recommend doing so and including that in your risk calculation and negotiations with your partner. Your experience level can also change how intense your drop is. Less experienced people, who often come into a scene being a bundle of nerves or bouncing off the walls with excitement, can have worse drop, mainly because they don't know how to mitigate for it yet, or they don't know what aftercare they might need. And even for more generally experienced people, new to you activities can also cause worse drop the first couple of times that you do them. Think of it like going to the gym. If you haven't worked out in years, a 10-minute run on the treadmill or a few minutes of jumping rope can lay you out on the floor the next day. But once you've done that a couple of times and your body no longer freaks out about all of the sudden new activity, you might have a little bit of soreness, but that's going to be about it. The same thing applies to kink. Your body has to adapt to the new activity, figure out it's not going to kill you, and then when it does, it won't hurt so bad the next day. And finally, the bigger the emotions you include in your play, the bigger the drop will likely be. Doing a lighthearted, silly, friendly spanking is often easier to process than a role-play heavy spanking where your partner acts like someone else that you don't know and ignores you as you beg for mercy, all while humiliating you in front of an audience the whole time, including your crush. If you're going to play with fear, embarrassment, anxiety, or any feeling that is generally viewed as negative, be ready for that to affect you when you do drop, especially if you have self-esteem or self-worth issues, and include that in your scene through something like humiliation play. It can really hit you and it can cause a lot of negative feelings, so be prepared for that one. And after mentioning that, you might be thinking, geez, it kind of seems like everything can cause a drop and everything makes drop worse. Surely there must be some kind of play that's less likely to cause drop that I can use instead, right? And the answer to that is kind of. The emotions you bring into an experience, as well as your personal history and previous experience with kink in general, matter a lot. But in my observation, some kinds of play are less likely to cause drop than others, for most people on average at least. Scenes involving elements like service, role play like pet play or CGL, praise kinks, or sensation play seem to be the least likely to cause drop, and when drop does occur, it tends to be milder. The scenes most likely to cause drop by comparison tend to include heavy impact play, heavy bondage, humiliation, or CNC, aka consensual non-consent. Anything that invokes a previous traumatic experience, and anything done to try and relive such an experience intentionally, also tends to cause a longer and more intense drop for most people. But again, all of these things are in general. I, for example, very rarely experience any kind of drop after a bondage scene, no matter how intense it is. That's just my body. Always has been. But I tend to get very pronounced drop even from relatively minor amounts of emotional sadomasochism because that's also how my body just works. But I know these things about myself so I can plan accordingly and communicate this to others when I'm negotiating for a scene with them. And hearing how many things can cause drop and how bad it can make you feel, you would be forgiven if your reaction to that was, isn't this a sign we shouldn't be doing this? Doesn't this mean that kink is causing people lasting harm? And, that is a thought that has crossed my mind a time or two before. In the throes of drop, it's not uncommon to think, I clearly should never do this ever again. Holy crap, I feel awful. And assume that because you feel like garbage right now, that means kink isn't for you. Drop isn't usually included in most romance books or erotica, is it, right? So if you're experiencing it, it must be because you can't handle doing BDSM, or BDSM is inherently bad for you. But this is not necessarily the case. As I mentioned before, doing kink is kind of like going to the gym. As your body gets used to it and adapts, the after effects will likely lessen somewhat over time. When you know what to expect, you can put plans in place ahead of time to cope with it more effectively. And moreover, something isn't bad just because it has side effects. We should be careful not to confuse pleasure with something being good for us, or discomfort with something being bad for us. Hiking, weightlifting, running marathons, or riding a bike can all cause cramps, soreness, and stiff muscles the next day. But most people wouldn't say that means that you're not meant to go hiking or that hiking is wrong. It just means that you might need to take an easier trail next time, do some cross-training beforehand, or drink some more water. That being said, sometimes the cost of drop can be too high for some people. If you have young children, you can't exactly be laid up in bed, sore and moping when they need you. If you have a demanding physical job, you can't completely drain your energy battery before the week starts. If your life circumstances mean you have a relatively low risk tolerance for longer or more pronounced drop, you'll need to calibrate how you play and how often you play to ensure you can still do the things you need to be able to do in your everyday vanilla life. But we have one more tool in our toolkit if we want to reduce the risk of drop or reduce how heavy it might be. And that tool is aftercare. I have several other videos discussing aftercare and aftercare techniques, which I will link down below, but I will also cover the basics here. Aftercare is the care that is provided after a scene is over to help bring the participants in the scene back into their everyday state and to mitigate the potential side effects from play. This can include changing into comfy clothes, caring for wounds or bruises, and addressing other more immediate concerns. But the main job of aftercare is to essentially seal in the good feelings from the scene you just had, reconnect with your partner, and to a certain extent prevent drop. On the physical side, this can include ensuring you're adequately hydrated, have nutritious food available, and have adequate rest. On the mental side, this can consist of giving and receiving verbal affirmation, discussing how the scene went with your partner, and doing activities you find to be mood-boosting and restorative, such as taking a hot shower or bath, cuddling, petting your dog, meditating, taking a light stroll outside, or watching a nature documentary or a favorite movie. Some people prefer to do the aftercare with their partner, while others prefer to do it alone. Some people prefer to do it with the person they played with, while other people do it with a more committed relationship. It's all about what works for you, but remember, you can't get something unless you ask for it. And you have to negotiate for your aftercare ahead of time, just like you do for everything else in your scenes. If you expect your partner to shower with you, cuddle with you, and spend the night, you have to say that ahead of time, in advance, and they have to agree to do it. You're not going to get it by default. Other folks just need a pat on the back and a water bottle and they're good to go. Finding the right aftercare technique can take some trial and error, but I think a good basic routine includes some light post-scene conversation and or cuddles with your partner, drinking some water, having a nutritious, protein-rich meal or snack, and getting at least 8 hours of sleep the night after. I'd also recommend taking a short walk outside or going on a treadmill at a low speed to lower the risk of muscle stiffness and soreness. A warm bath with magnesium bath salts or a shower followed by a magnesium lotion can also help. And don't skimp on checking in with your play partner either. Even if you're just casual and only hanging out to play together, getting emotional support can be a critical part of aftercare preventing drop. It might sound silly, but sometimes just hearing that you're still a good person who's fun to be around, who is valuable and worthy, can help more than anything. As you figure out what works for you, I recommend keeping a scene diary where you record what play you did, what aftercare you did, and how you feel over the next, say, 48 to 72 hours. Once you get enough data points, you should start to see correlations about what works for you and what tends to cause the most drop. And outside of aftercare, there's another layer that I think a lot of people forget about, and that would be how you set up the scene itself. Because there's so many variables, from if you're playing in public or not, to the room, how familiar you are with the environment, how cold it is, what furniture you're using. It's a lot to get into in just a video like this, but I would also carefully look at in your diary the setting of what you're doing and the environment around it, right? Like, if you're doing a scene in private, in a cold room with like no music, totally quiet, does that make your drop worse or better compared to playing in public with loud music and maybe not having a lot of ongoing conversation during the scene with your partner? Whereas maybe the other one, you were having a lot more kind of check-ins and conversation as you were playing and doing the scene. So also, how you set up the scene space can really matter a lot here too. So also factor that in. Also think about where you want to do your aftercare. Some people want to get it all done at the dungeon before they leave. Other people want to go home and do it right away. Other people prefer to do it at their partner's house. That's also another factor to look at and see if it changes anything for you. The main thing I'd also say about drop 2 as sort of a final note in this video is that drop can also change over the experience that you have in BDSM. So the longer that you're in the scene, your experience of drop can change. And I don't mean just that it might get more mild, that is the most common, but as you take on new roles, as you have new partnerships, as you get more experience doing different things, as you're doing play in different settings, you can have ups and downs with your drop too. Another factor I don't really see a lot of people talking about is your hormone cycle. Where you are at in your hormone cycle can impact drop. Like, I know if I do a scene while I'm in the middle of PMSing, I am going to have worse drop than if I do it on the opposite end of my cycle. So that's another factor to consider too in your journaling. By the way, everyone has a cycle. It's not just people who get periods. Everyone has one. Just that's the one that people tend to know about the most. So also maybe if you can track that, think about tracking that as well, just so you can get an idea of like, hey, you know, we're planning a big scene for this weekend. It looks like according to my tracker chart, I'm going to be PMSing that weekend. So because of that, I know I'm going to need like a higher level of aftercare. So you can also include that in your negotiations as well. But with that being said, that's about what I have to say on the topic of drop. It is something that can affect pretty much everyone in BDSM, as I've been talking about. Sub, dom, top, bottom, and it really just depends on your individual brain, your biology, and the kinds of things that you're doing. So I would love to hear thoughts about this one in a comment down below. What have you found helps you the most with drop? How does drop look to you? Especially if you have a more unconventional side to your drop, like the way you experience it is different than what I've talked about in this video. Please feel free to share it in a comment below, because I know that I almost certainly did not cover every different way that drop can look. I've just talked about what I think are the most classic symptoms here. And yeah, with that being said, that's everything I have to talk about today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy this, please do subscribe, because I make videos twice a week about all different topics from BDSM, kink, polyamory, queer issues, asexuality, and so much more. And finally, if you want to support what I do, the best way you can do that is with Patreon. Link to that will be down below. If you do already support there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.